Welcome back to these videos ranking the top 90 dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV, by which I mean all 90 dungeons, released from A Realm Reborn's launch up to 6.5. If you were here not having watched the first video, well, I'm not going over how I came to these rankings again. You're just going to have to deal with it. Go back and watch, or suffer the consequences. If you do choose to proceed, spoiler warning, like I said, this does include Endwalker and its patches. This is the 60th to the 31st dungeon, the middle tier dungeon in this video. These are generally in the category of, yeah, they're fine. Most of them are alright enough. They're dungeons I wouldn't mind running in a random roulette, but they're not the stuff that usually gets me super excited. But there's probably going to be some people's favorites that ended up dropping down here because there's a lot of good dungeons in FF14. Unlike the first lake being predominantly filled by Realm Reborn era dungeons, you're going to see more variety of the expansions represented as the quality just gets generally higher and higher. So, let's not waste any more time and get to it with number 60. Baelsar's Wall. It's Castrum Meridianum 2! The lead-in dungeon to Stormblood is made up of a whole lot of pieces that don't really create anything all that special to me. Now, let's get something out of the way. There is one reason everyone remembers this place, or rather one word. Sloppy. Yes, it's a big showdown boss we've been waiting, like, an entire expansion to kick the butt of for what he did. Yes, it's a great meme, and it's also actually a pretty good fight, look at it. But that's probably the most you remember about this dungeon immediately, or it was most of what I did. The rest is basically Castrum Meridianum 2, except now in Gridania instead of Thanalan. It goes a little heavier in some parts, with stuff like the conveyor belt segment, which I'd normally credit for the score, but oh my god, that part goes on forever. Its music is, I mean, it's fine, but it's not exactly inspirational. You can start to see why this place is so forgettable. The other two bosses aren't exactly standing all that tall either. I like Dynamic Century Jammer on the second one. I mean, it's Acceleration Bomb, but it's fun and used interestingly. But that's like it. Baelsar's Wall is okay, and being that it's a Castrum Meridianum 2, it does beat out the original, like it probably should. It's not too sloppy of a dungeon, but it's just alright. It only barely squeaks in as the first of our middle ranking dungeons. I don't know, man, I enjoy the big pull at the end. That is fair. Being able to pull the entire last leg is nice. It's just, that conveyor belt section is literally like 6 forcibly spaced out pulls. None of which are threatening. Okay. 59. Hullbreaker Isle. When I sit down and think about the pieces of Hullbreaker Isle, the dungeon is okay. Decent bosses, decent music, the island look is really nice and is kind of my jam. The trash is varied, with stuff like the chest mimics, and I am very fond of the bear traps in the first leg that you have forgotten are there, but your tank just stepped in one, got yoinked back into it, and it was really funny. Most of its bosses are fine enough. I have PTSD about giant gorillas in 14 thanks to Palace of the Dead, but like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with this. Well, okay, that's a lie. There's something wrong with this place's bosses, or rather boss singular. Kraken Round 1 is a bad boss fight, and that's not surprising anyone to say that. I give it a point solely for being genuinely unique, but it is such an unclear slow slog of a fight that because of the mechanics underpinning it, can take forever if somebody keeps trying to chase the arms in the last stretch. Listen, I think naming it the worst boss of 2.x is a pretty easy opinion to defend, and it's a good example of how a unique boss fight does not necessarily equate to an enjoyable boss fight. Beyond that, the pieces of Hullbreaker are actually pretty solid. We're reaching the point of almost being at half of the possible scoring for this system. So the fact that it has a big weak point does drag it down, but like, otherwise it's fine. If it didn't have the Kraken boss fight, I think I would quite enjoy Hullbreaker Isle, but it definitely ends on a sour note. Yoshi said Bear Trap Isle. Flex said, oh, banana. Kuji said, yeah, I hated the Kraken, and those exploding tornadoes are oof. Yeah, the worst part is it's hard for a new player to even understand why they just died to the tornadoes. Okay. 58. Kugane Castle. The most forgettable of Stormblood's dungeon to me, it's a raid on a fancy Japanese-style manor. I could stop the commentary right there. Now, to be nice, there is one very neat thing that I love, and that is iconic to this place, and that is the final boss fight being Yojimbo, and the fight gimmick where you need to grab the piles of cash before Daigoro grabs them for Yojimbo to keep him from considering himself paid and unleashing his full power at you. It was a cool place to have this FFX cameo appear, and a cool way to integrate him. But other than that, Kugane Castle is a Japanese-style manor, and that's just the entire dungeon. It plays out with the exact scenery you expect, the exact type of enemies you expect. Like, you have a boss who flips around the tatami mats as a ninja, because that's a Japanese manor thing. Like, just... by the way, this is my least favorite second boss in Stormblood, partially because Stormblood has a decent standard of second bosses-ish, but also he's really flat outside of the flavoring of the tatami flipping animation. And that's kind of just it, is this entire place is running on its concept, which you would think would be a good way, but I feel like so little is actually done that really excels? I don't know. You can forget Kugane Castle. Oh, my song said, Kugane Castle. Oh, I wish more stuff happened at Kugane Castle. Exactly. Yeah, the music is pretty good. It's just, you know, exactly what you'd want out of this place. 57. Amdapor Keep, Hard Mode. The last of the dungeons of 2.x were revisits of the last dungeons of the launch. But while Amdapor Keep and Wanderer's Palace original version have both aged pretty horribly with overgearing, its successors have held up alright. Amdapor Hard feels more cursed than the original did. The living, thrashing foliage blocks your way and summons reinforcement, the air gets more ominous as you get further in, there's the whole, like, rush to destroy the ads before the demon walls crash in on you that, like, okay, that is easy, but it's a cool set piece. It all helps to give this place an atmosphere that the original wanted you to believe was there, but was never there. Now, we are still in ARR, which means the bosses aren't so hot, but they aren't necessarily the worst either. I do like chasing down the boogeymen and managing the two of them while also keeping an eye on the corpses so they don't explode. Faraday has pretty simple mechanics, but at least puts some interesting flavor on the usual burn down the ad systems. Like, he gets his real time to shine later. They're okay for ARR. The return trip to the keep maintains the singular strength of the original, the variety in the trash encounters, and then makes a point to actually score some points in other categories as well, giving it an actual flavor and memorability. In the previous video, I talked about a lot of hard modes that failed, but this is a good demonstration of how it could have, like, just been an improvement, because I think singularly, this one is. Yoshi said, I do always love the immaculate spooky vibes of the music. Oh, it's so good, yeah. Honestly, probably could have given it more points for the audio. It just... This is like the atmosphere that Malik as well was trying to do, but the rest of the dungeon actually matches that. Number 56. Castrum Abania. It's Castrum Meridianum 3! Yeah, when you get down to it, a lot of the Garlean dungeons kind of really blend together. But the Stormblood era on the Stormblood take on the concept is probably the best of the Castrums. What holds Abania above the others is just generally having better combat. You get the Zoomy Bastard that is the Magna Rotor, and you get the reworked number 24, who, spicy take, his fight got completely reworked. It used to have a unique gimmick that was super boring and basic. Now it's actually a really cool fight, and I like it a lot. And the final boss amps up his attacks the longer the fight goes on too, though you might finish it before it becomes anything too significant. The combat strength also isn't limited to just the bosses. There's lots of trash coming at you in high numbers. There's the DPS race tanks, which feel great to successfully destroy before they summon their ads, because it is possible to destroy them all, but it's never easy. All of this, though, does have to make up for a fairly visual presentation, because Albania kind of is just another Castrum. It's all stuff we've seen before at this point. The Magitech Research Facility from 6 is where this place drew all of its bosses, and I feel like if its visual design had have leaned more into the Magitech Research Facility aspect, it would have given itself a way stronger identity, and this could have been a really high-placing dungeon as a result. As it is, it's alright. Oh, my song said, Garleans sure love sticking wheels on people. They really do, and that's weird. Kuji said, that's a hot take, but I accept it. It's as in, you think this should be higher, or do you think this should be lower? Oh, the second boss take. Yeah, no, I think the second boss as it is now is actually really good. Like, it shows you an easy version of a mechanic, and then gives you, like, the, hey, here's the hard executional one, and then it's onto a completely different set. It doesn't repeat itself. It is a great variety. Like, even though it is technically repeating its mechanics, it's evolving them each time. I really enjoyed the new version of the boss. Anyway, number 55. Bet you're surprised this one lasted so long. The Sunken Temple of Karn. I could tell you stories about the horrors of Karn during 2.0. If you think you've had bad parties because they wiped once or twice, or the damage was a little low, try having a party literally never get past the first boss. No, seriously, that was after an hour of waiting in queue. For being an ARR dungeon, and a mid-level one at that, Karn didn't mess around. Haven't learned to focus down ads? Have the bees with the instant kill. Here's Teratotar with a doom mechanic, and the bees as reinforcements coming out again and again. Have a multi-phased final boss, where you have the choice to focus the boss or to engage with the various ads to make the upcoming mechanics easier. Have optional puzzles throughout the dungeon. Mobs with spicy cleaves, enemies you have to kill while they're sitting on switches to open the doors, and more. These days, Karn is easier because of player power creep, and it still looks and sounds like an ARR dungeon. But even if the major puzzle and exploration turned out to all be very skippable, Karn was attempting something as a dungeon that no other dungeon in 14 does, and it becomes really memorable to me as a result. Would I want every dungeon to be Karn? Hell no, absolutely not. But because no other dungeon is Karn, it cuts itself a unique place in 14 as my pick for the third best dungeon of launch ARR. Flux said this is a tank test dungeon. Oh, my song said lots of instant death here. Oh yeah. Very Indiana Jones, where a monk can learn to tank. Yep. Best first boss of ARR? Yeah, I can dig it. Yeah, it's easily the most notable first boss encounter in ARR. Anyway, for my flaming hot take on the second best launch dungeon of ARR, the Aurum Vale at 54. If I could have found reason to, I'd have placed this higher. Much higher. I love Aurum Vale. When I tell you I consider the Trashier to be a 5 out of 5, the best of ARR, and maybe the best in the whole game, you probably either think I'm crazy or you get it. This hellhole is famous for slaughtering both new players and cocky veterans alike in its first leg. That first segment, with all the trash and the environmental hazards and the wandering mobs, destroys people. Regardless of what class you are on, you will feel alive and wake the hell up when you queue into Aurum. Unless you're a coward who just runs because you got it in roulette. It helps that most of the rest of this place is actually pretty alright. Even with his AoEs marked so players can learn swings and swipes, coin counter's still fun. You get, like, the Miser's Mistress is still a fairly fun fight, thanks to the gigantic AoEs and the ticking poisons that will just suddenly wipe you out. Like, I like the Aurum Vale all throughout. Now, under this ranking, this is as high as I can justify for it. It still has basically no audio experience. It still looks kind of dated and a little bit samey, even if I actually do kind of like its specifically poisoned aesthetic. And it's still kind of just got launch ARR grade bosses, even if it's on the better end of that scale. But I am here specifically for the chaos and corpses this dungeon creates. When I got this, for this ranking, my party died like 4 times and I was having an absolute blast. You do not forget Aurum Vale, though many try to forget it. And to me, that's the mark of a baller dungeon. I feel, Fire Lamplight said, I feel like people feel like Aurum Vale like some people feel about tequila. Tequila, hell yeah, or tequila, 1,000-yard stare. Yoshi said, hellhole, affectionate. Oh, Bear said, the cap being just below 50 is rude. Oh, absolutely. No benediction for you? No hollowed ground to get out of trouble? Pay attention or die. And that's why I love Aurum Vale. Okay. Moving on. 53. St. Mokine's Arboretum. One of the more distinctive locales for a dungeon, this massive greenhouse has just enough Charlian structure to remind you that you're not in the wild, despite how over-the-top gorgeous this place is. It's just a fantastic dungeon to wander through, to look around in. Way more appealing to me than the muddied, stagnant version that we see on the list. Especially since there's more visual variety, thanks to like the whole giant hive section in the center. Though I could understand if that turns somebody off. And while music without energy can often drag it down a dungeon run, Mokine's theme nails that kind of sad longing that comes from abandonment. I want to go take a nature walk through this place with that music playing. Now, unfortunately, the battle side of the Arboretum isn't super hot. The trash is pretty basic, minus the walls of honey to smash down, though I guess you can pull fairly big. Similarly, the final boss, Belladonna, has a neat idea in marking off areas, and then does nothing with it. I do like the Wasp boss, though, and its command of different ads, even if you might not see all the mechanics of the fight anymore. And the spinning Morble and its really bad breath is fun to dodge with the others to weave around. Still, those aren't really enough to push the Arboretum any higher than this spot for me. It's a solid enough dungeon that I really like, but if this is anybody's favorite, it's probably entirely for the aesthetic. Which, yeah, I would understand. I'm even looking at these scores now and going like, I probably could have afforded this one a 5 for visuals, maybe. Like, it's just a really gorgeous place. Obear said, it's a vibe for sure. Fire Lamplight said, the music! Flux said, one I wish I could see more of in the roulette. Yeah, this place is really memorable and just really nice. 52. I hated having to place this next one this low. Shisui of the Violet Tides. On revisiting this dungeon to make this ranking, I had some unfortunate realizations about this place. We'll save that for a moment, though, because, goddamn, have you looked at this place? It's a traditional palace deep beneath the waves, full of gorgeous coral structures, and so much just done with the architecture and the vistas, and just... this place is gorgeous. Shisui is Stormblood's most beautiful dungeon to me, and you add in the ephemeral music track, and just... presentationally, this place is incredible. And its trash does try, with stuff like the mobs that hide in the sand and the exploding pufferfish and all. Unfortunately, 3 out of my 7 categories are the boss fights. The Ruby Princess does have the color of cursing yourself with aging to avoid her seduction, which is cute. It's a decent boss fight. Unfortunately, Amakiri's a tank and spank, and then Shisui Yohi is a tank and spank that dives under the water to run away from you for a while so you can deal with the ads, and does nothing really all that interesting. And it's that weak boss lineup that really drags Shisui down, because I think its first and third boss are the worst first and third boss in Stormblood, unfortunately. And that's really unfortunate, because its really excellent visuals should be able to carry it higher than this. But oof. Oh, my song said, props to this dungeon letting you fart around as an old person for the shiggles. Yep, absolutely. Fire Lamplight said, the architecture is chef's kiss. Absolutely. Like, just, absolutely so gorgeous. I just wish this place had better bosses. The trash is still trying stuff here, and, like, the standards for trash in FF14 are pretty low. So even just stuff like, oh, there's wandering pufferfish in the cages in the last leg, that's a point by itself, you know? Okay, 51. The Wanderer's Palace, hard. The return to the Tonberry Palace no longer has them as threats slowly lumbering towards us, instead we're trying to save them. Now, due to that, the palace does lose some of what made the original so unique, even if it does find some of its own footing and strength in return. What does stand out now is everything to do with the core mechanic of this place, banners. There's the way the banners buff up the ads and you need to drag them away. There's the banners in the second boss, which are randomly reassigned every time you fight him, so you have to find the correct banners to solve the mechanic anew every single time. Favorite second boss in 2.x, because that's a cool mechanic. Also, the final boss is actually really fun. He's got his own neat mechanics going on. Involving banners, but also, like, repeating AoEs from him. I wish the first boss was good, but that boss has been hurt a huge amount by power creep, unfortunately. Add in an alright music track that is kind of a little bit sad to fit the plight of the Tonberries. Decent looks, because the original Wanderer's Palace already looked alright. And Wanderer's Heart could have placed even higher. Unfortunately, its first boss is just, like I mentioned, demolished by power creep into being absolutely nothing and dragging the palace down. But I'm pretty cool with Wanderer's Palace Heart. We're hitting about the middle of the road for the game here, and for 2.x overall, it's one of the better ones, and, like, we really are in the, yeah, I'm alright being here territory. Cecil says, triumphant Final Fantasy victory fanfare, horrified reaction to off-screen mob stabbing. Yup, that was a fantastic moment. Fire Lamplight said, that last boss would defeat random parties. Oh, absolutely, that thing will dunk on people who don't know what they're doing. Especially the Doom mechanic. If you didn't catch that dialogue bubble hint, your healer might not be saving you. Number 50. The Airy. There are some dungeons like Shisui that were hurt by me revisiting them and having to face the reality of my memories, and then some like the Airy that actually benefited. I still think this dungeon is a little underserved by its music never really going anywhere or carrying the intensity that the raid on an ancient dragon's lair should have. But it's hard to pretend its storm-ridden and, like, violet aesthetic isn't actually pretty unique for 14. The place is a combination of crumbling ruin and alien crystal formations, and it's infested by Nidhogg's brood, which gives it a solid sense of identity. The issue mainly is in the first couple bosses. Rangda is pretty whatever with a small gimmick, but I don't know if you've been there recently, but Gaxus did get hurt by his rework. Not only is he conceptually less interesting, even the actual execution of the fight is notably less interesting now too. Nidhogg did come out pretty neutral from the rework. Yes, a lot of the flavor of the ad phase with protecting Edstinian is gone, but he gained a greater variety of moves and a greater cohesion with later dragon fights in Nidhogg's, like, eventual rematch, which really showed up. I do feel like the area should be better than it is. It never quite reaches any major heights to me. And for what I think is the halfway point of Heavensward's story in its first major climactic battle, one would think they would have gone just that extra little bit. But it's here still. It's alright. Cecil said, I still don't know how to feel about the change to the final boss from before the Tress. Like I said, it's up and down for me. It lost a little bit and it gained some. Oh, my song said, I feel like the pace of the area is really fun. It feels like a big push forward towards Nidhogg. Understandable. I just think it didn't quite, like, get through as big as I wanted. But it did. It definitely, like, you can feel the changes in that. Okay. 49. The Ether Font. One of the more gorgeous of Endwalker's dungeons. And let's be real, that's a sky-high bar. The only problem is, we've seen it all before. See, here's the thing. The Ether Font is a very pretty dungeon with some gorgeous music and some great boss fights. Now, mind you, the visual aesthetic of the area and the music feels more like it should be the Charlian Field area, because a good chunk of it kind of is. And that doesn't necessarily match a bot, like the feeling of being a dungeon. We do get some good boss fights here. We get the big strange friend, who's pretty alright, if maybe a little bit simple for how far it is in the boss. We get Volibear. I love the Volibear fight. That is a surprisingly intense second boss fight with all the AoEs. And of course, at the end, we get the surprise appearance of FF4's Octomammon, aka the Kraken, but now it's actually a good fight. It just doesn't have things wasting your time like the others did. But in spite of that, like, the Ether Font is down here because it just doesn't pack the punch of a dungeon, to me. It's just kind of a Charlian Field area, and because its trash is garbage. It is the most stringently structured basic trash in the entire game. 2 pulls of 2 packs each, then a boss, repeat. There is nothing to write home about anywhere in this, and at patch 6.4 that shouldn't be happening. The Ether Font isn't defensive. Even with its flaws, it is still breaking the halfway mark for total possible score at 18 out of 35. But from what I expect from Endwalker, it was really on the more boring side of things. Bear said, hot take, bears are cute, but don't make the dungeon interesting alone. Yeah. Lots of comments on the bears. I do love the bears as a background element. It's just that this dungeon, I don't know. It's just not there for me. I think this is the second dungeon from Endwalker, and we're all the way up at number 49 out of 90. So, like, no wait, this is the second Endwalker dungeon to make this list. 48. Don't. Doma Castle. Speaking of big assaults like the Airy that feel like they should be a little bit more somehow. Now, I do want to start by saying, Gates of the Moon is a groovy track with a lot of energy, but it's also kind of completely mismatched with the fact that this is a war zone that is, like, simultaneously an important liberating raid, and also a tragedy as we have to destroy Doma Castle. It does kind of sabotage the identity of this place a little bit to me, and makes it feel a little bit weird. Its bosses are alright. Not bad, each of them having their own little gimmicks and attack patterns, like the first boss introducing the moving markers we now often refer to as exaflares, but none of them are really all that potent, and I feel like after the rework, Mr. Name Days is just a lot slower paced and doesn't do as much that's interesting. Everything else, it's fine. I mean, you get segments like the turrets, you get a lot of detail in the specific way that this landscape is ruined. That is nice to look at, that's solid. You get a decent variety of look to the trash and the environments. It is making a solid effort. But to me, nothing about Doma Castle really stands out to be super exciting. It should be, given it's the conclusion to the Dome and half of Stone Bullet's War. It's a big event, but I just don't think anything quite feels as big as it needed to. Robert said, I liked it. It's not Castrum form, it's like a victory lap before liberating Doma. Definitely some conflict on whether the music is, like, fitting for the big, like, turnaround of the story or not. I could see where people would place this probably higher, but yeah, this one for me is just, it's alright. I realized I once again accidentally marked it as 49 on my screen when it should be 48, but whatever, mistakes will happen. I think this is one that moved up and down a little bit as I was even writing it. 47. Selfetal. I feel like putting this, like, immediately next to Doma Castle feels a bit weird, but, like, Selfetal is somehow, like, one good step away from being a really good dungeon to me. It has a surprisingly cohesive theme in Wind. The Ixali homeland is a mountain base where the flightless birds have built themselves into the sky, and we follow them from the cliffs to the scaffolding to their airships. And that thematic pervades through its bosses, from getting knocked airborne to pop the balloons, to getting knocked around by the giant fan, to the final boss literally summoning Garuda at your ass. Like, it has a cohesive, pervasive theme to it that I think is really cool. The problem is that none of that is really exceeding kind of in the same deal as Doma Castle did. Like, the aesthetic is just, there isn't enough pop to the visual aspects of it to really sell a lot of it to me. The trash is trying a little bit of stuff with, like, tight spaces and big AoEs, but isn't really doing all that much of note. Like, the balloon reinforcement segment has been cut somewhat, by the way. Like, you don't have to fight down the balloons, which could be a pro or con depending on how you think about it. I just see it kind of in the same way that I see Doma Castle, where it's solid. There isn't major problems with Zelfetal, but nothing really excites you. Nothing really gets you going in there. Gobert and Sage both surprised at how high this is. I kind of am too, and, like, it's just solid. Like, there isn't really a problem with this dungeon. I think this had the exact same score as Doma Castle, so if you want to switch those in your mental placement, go ahead. 46. The Anti-Tower. As we hit the middle of our rankings, we travel up the we travel leftwards into the Anti-Tower. One of the more abstract locations in 14, the Anti-Tower is a strange reversed castle that I think to achieve true greatness, the Anti-Tower would have had to have spent more time exploring that as a structure rather than dipping into an abstract space outside of it and then just the magic zone in the middle of it. This isn't to say that it's not pretty. Like, the fairy tale style of this place is really cool, the music's got a lot to do with that too. Using more peaceful tracks is risky for dungeons unless it is complementing something, and in this case it's complementing that specifically, like, Matoya-esque style of fantasy fairy tale that I think is really cool and unique presentationally. Unfortunately, it's got pretty boring gameplay. The trash are almost entirely unremarkable and easily beaten down. The bosses have not handled the power creep well, and honestly weren't super fun to begin with. Calcabrina's neat. It's a neat boss in thematic and presentation. I love them bringing back the old theme. I love fighting the individual ones, and then dealing with the total one. But it's still a pretty easy and straightforward boss. Yeah. My sense of the Anti-Tower is that this is one of those dungeons that is very much carried by its presentation, and is fun the first time through, but the more that you've done it, the more that you realize there isn't much to the gameplay side of things. And we're kind of starting to reach the point where, like, that will only carry a dungeon so far. Oh, my song said, walking on the ceiling is great for sure. Absolutely. When I got to the final boss, I screamed no. Understandable. Yeah. The fact that it's kind of a breeze with the atmosphere and the music makes it kind of enjoyable to me. Yeah, it isn't terrible, but it's just, the gameplay side I think is just kind of bland. Either way, this marks the exact halfway mark on the list. So everything from here on is in the upper half of the dungeons in 14. Which, keep in mind some of the things that have already dropped on the lower half. 45. Hell's Lid. Cresting the halfway mark of this list, we descend straight into a volcano. The starting point of the Four Lords questline leaves a mark with its gorgeous fiery visuals and then its surprisingly serene lakeside hidden temple. Just a shame the middle section is so whatever. But no, seriously, that sort of reflects the dungeon itself. You get the super cool volcanic area, where we dive into the flames and are literally surrounded by monsters reaching out of the magma towards us. Then we fight an OK giant-style boss, descend through a somewhat forgettable cavern, fight the OK wind snake, who's actually a ferret. I love the ferret. And then we pop out for the final section, dropping down to a gorgeous lake underground, fighting through a dangerously large adpole, some mini-bosses, and we get to fight Genbu, who challenges us with unique AoE patterns in a hexagon-themed arena that's distinct to him. It's a solid start, and a great end, with a weak middle. Also limiting Hell's Lid to me as the place is the fact that the music is fine, but not exceptional. And while the sites individually are great, the dungeon feels a little bit mismatched between its sections. It doesn't quite feel like it connects to itself. Still, the good parts are more than enough to help, and Hell's Lid, I think, deserves its solid placement dead center of the dungeons in 14. Yoshi said, the Noodle Yokai. I mean, I like the Noodle Yokai, but I like him better when he's little tiny and running from you. Sage said, that's because they're sections for the Four Lords. I mean, I guess, technically, sort of, but yeah. I will say, like, I absolutely love this like, just the look of this final section is so cool to me. Even with the fact that I dislike the middle section's look, it still has a 4 in visuals, which should tell you a lot. Okay, 44. Lapis Manalis. Man, all of Endwalker's appearances on this list so far, in other words, the worst parts of it, have all been the most recent patch dungeons. Oops. Still, the third worst of the expansion makes it into the upper half. Lapis Manalis is carried actually by its great boss fights. In particular, the Reaper training dummy is a fun fight with a variety of neat attacks, and at the end we get a stellar fight with Kignazo of the Four Fiends, who brings a wide variety of attacks to the table that just creates a really fun mini-trial style fight. It's the strength we expect out of bosses as far into the game, and Lapis Manalis does largely deliver. Except for the weakest first boss in Endwalker, Albion has one gimmick in its Stampede, and that's just a don't stand in the zone, and maybe I'll do a mechanic to match, which isn't really much of anything. And the rest? The trash is only barely escaping a zero via the carriage segment at the start. The music is alright, but kind of forgettable, and the visuals of the dungeon are good enough, but most of it isn't super remarkable, with only the final leg actually looking that neat. And I mean, like Hell's Lid, it kind of suffers from the segments of the dungeon feeling disconnected, though I do like the lore chunk of the Reaper village that's right next to the Cerulean Lake and all. It's a bit of a mess of a dungeon. It's still solid enough to play through because of the later bosses in it, but I feel like it's one of the weaker dungeons for this late in the game. Yoshi said, I forgot about this dungeon. Understandable. Flex said, I like the lore of the middle boss, and I like when she tells me off for poor DPS. I do like that little gimmick of testing your DPS and calling you out for it. Yeah. It's just not quite there for me. 43. Academia Anider. Hey, by the way, this is only the second appearance of Shadowbringers on this list, which should tell you something about how high the dungeon quality soars in this expansion. Oh, people are immediately mad at me. Best described as Bioshock's Resident Evil lab, this ancient memory of an academic laboratory is a fascinating place to look around. And it's accompanied by a real cool smooth jazz mix with a very memorable, radio-style opening. It shouldn't be a surprise that with all the lore and the unique feel, this place soars in terms of its presentation. It's got an alright showing on the boss front, too. Left Shark and Right Shark is a cool concept that I think maybe needs a little bit more to it. The Morball Abomination here, is stuff we've unfortunately seen before by this point with the Void Arc, but now with the tiniest of little tweaks, which isn't really that much. I do like fighting Quetzalcoatl at the end of it. That's a cool cameo with the whole mechanic of intercepting the charges left behind by his attacks, but he doesn't quite have the variety to really super shine on it. And what really drags this place down is that I think it's got the worst trash in Shadowbringers, because there's absolutely nothing I can think of to talk about it. There's nothing to it. It's super basic, boring, and structured, and that hurts this place. And that's really unfortunate, because this, if this place had decent trash, it would be placing significantly higher. But, it is catching a loss for just really failing on the trash front. But it's still at 43rd here. Aubert said, so I'm biased by the fact that this is the dungeon and music combined with seeing other clips that got me to pull the trigger and start FF14. I understand that. Presentationally, this place is hell yeah amazing. Just, again, this is one of those dungeons where, I replayed it and I'm like, oh, ooh, that's unfortunate. On a personal ranking where I wasn't scoring all of these categories and taking that into account, probably would have placed better, but that was the ranking system I settled on and I stuck to it, regardless of how much I hated it sometimes. Okay, 42. Speaking of dungeons people will be mad about. The Burn. What if I told you that The Burn is one of the most averagely 3 out of 5 dungeons on this list? The burn is remembered primarily by a fantastic last leg. Like, that is a gorgeous vista you come out on. The seemingly infinite expanse of the aether-blasted lands, and of course the big set-piece final boss, who used to demolish parties, the Mist Dragon. He's been nerfed a little bit, but he's still not a joke. Here's the thing. What everybody tends to forget is everything before the last leg. The ugly sandstorm-covered mountain, the really kind of standard ARR degree cave with just a little touch of Rectaligan tech that we've seen before. Like, do you even remember the Crystal Scorpion that's the first boss? Because I know I had completely forgotten what the first boss of this place was. Everything's here's fine. Even the ads are, like, okay. They're not doing much, but you do get a little bit of environmental AoEs, or, like, large enough AoEs to be sort of notable. You get an alright, fittingly ethereal music track that does eventually fade into something more cohesive and adventurous and pretty good, but isn't great. That's just the thing, is you look at the burn as a whole, and not just by its ending segment. And I feel like the dungeon just doesn't quite live up to how good the ending segment is. If the rest of the dungeon was that good, holy crap. But the burn is more than its last leg. Sage said, I'm kind of surprised it scored as high as you did. Huh. Flex said, I'm not mad about this one. Huh. I expected that one to make people angrier. Maybe it will in the YouTube comments when this is released to a greater audience. 41. The Lost City of Amdapor Hard. Okay, it's got a fantastic rainy atmosphere, a fully piano-driven rendition of the original theme, a slightly more hopeful spin. Our revisit to the Lost City juxtaposes its decaying ruins with fading everything into light. When we emerge in front of the Angelic Lion statue, fight it off, and reach a land poisoned by light, like, we didn't really think that theme was going to matter as much as it does now. Thanks to fairly solid trash pulls, like stuff like having to drag enemies into the light to debuff them, like some alright boss fights, the gameplay front is solid here too. I do think the first boss is probably the best of them though, because Neurosquam is a fun mechanic to do with people who don't know what's going on. The rest of it is kind of eh. Karibu in specific is kind of unfortunate. The idea of a reversed white mage who is casting healing spells that you would know, but as attack spells, that's cool, but those end up actually resulting in extremely basic mechanics, and she dies super fast now, so she's kind of just, she happens and then she's over, and you barely notice. Still, like, we are at 20 out of 35 possible points. I think there's a lot of good here, and a very solid presentation. Like, I don't think this is quite as good as the original, but this being roughly in the middle of the list of the entire dungeons of the game speaks to the quality of the dungeons that are still to come. Oh, my song said, this is the hard mode makeover that really stuck with me the most. It feels so sparse and dead, and also would trigger your allergies. Yeah. Lots of mentioning of the Shadowbringers foreshadowing. Flex said, I could listen to this all day. Yeah, this track is fantastic. She does get back up over and over again, but, like, that's like flavor as opposed to actual mechanical depth, I guess. Okay, number 40. Hey, remember how far Never replaced down the list? The Fractal Continuum is up here. Now, I slightly exaggerated a bit ago. The Fractal Continuum is the most 3 out of 5 dungeon on this list. And keep in mind, 3 out of 5 is like average on the side of, yeah, this is good to me. Literally the only two on the sheet is the first boss, who just is a little bit simple, but is still somewhat engaging. The Continuum's name doesn't have much to do with what it actually is. The ancient Allegan Museum and Zoo, long abandoned and taken over by its inhabitants, and it's just solid. There's lots of interesting architecture and lore to pick up, even though like a lot of that is the Allegan aesthetic that we see in so many other places in the game. You get a, honestly, pretty jamming theme that keeps you driving. It's got a solid variety of trash, especially the different encounters near the end of it. You get the Curator, who unfortunately suffers a little bit due to like the amount of DPS you can do kind of trivializes a lot of the mechanics of him trying to cut off the floor, but I still like him. Yeah, to me it's very much a 3 out of 5 on average on the side of good. Maybe I'm being a little bit generous with its bosses, but I've always really liked this place. Maybe specifically because it was being contrasted to Neverreap and was blowing it out of the hecking water. Nothing really stands out as amazing anymore, but also, like I said, 3 out of 5. Good dungeon, thumbs up. Where said the dungeon theme makes it slightly over average to me, but objectively, yeah. Yeah, this is cool. I think you're thinking of the hard mode. What hard mode? This hard mode? $39, the Fractal Continuum hard. I promise, this was an accident. I was just as surprised as you are to see these end up right next to each other. A hard mode revisit that genuinely lives up to the original. The Continuum steps it up a little bit on some front, but does lose a little bit in return. Specifically, the completely new final leg adds some additional visual variety that really helps the place out. The test subjects attempting to smash their way out of the cells adds a dynamic sense of terror and tension. And the crash against the glass augments the audio score, which is already high from the strong band performance of the original track. I think it loses a bit of the allure as the museum, as like the lore side and identity side of the place. But, you know, it's still really cool. Unexpectedly, what I think the Continuum actually loses out on its revisit on is the boss fights, because overgearing has hurt them a lot. The giant Allegan USB drive does not live long enough to do that much. The Ultima Warrior will barely even get through one of the Warring Triad phases that it has anymore, never mind all three. And then Ultima Beast used to rely on just huge damage hits, tank busters, flares, etc. to threaten your party, and now that you can outgear that, doesn't really do as much. So, like, whether you prefer the original Fractal or its successor, I could go either way. They could have easily been flipped, it was literally down to a personal choice, but I do think I slightly preferred the Goes Harder sequel. Point is this is actually the third best hard mode on this list, and puts up a really solid showing. Fire Lamplight said the jump scare got me back then. Yeah? Flux said USB! USB! $38. The Keeper of the Lake. Being the big set-piece dungeon that ended off the 2.x patch series, Keeper of the Lake is the traipse up an old, fallen Garlean warship wrapped in the body of the progenitor of dragonkind. What a cool idea! Even if it doesn't quite live up to that, its theme is pretty solid. The use of the wreckage is deliberate. It has a pretty memorable trash pull midway through on a reactivated part of the ship where you can actually go pretty hard if you're willing. Although I do actually have to slightly penalize the audio because I hate alarm sounds in dungeons that just keep going. It actually drives me slightly nuts. It's ballooned back up though when you come up to the top and do fight Midgard Sormer, and you get the amazing track that is Primogenitor. His fight, by the way, was completely reworked, so we are actually fighting Midgard Sormer now, not a proxy. It's a very different fight from how it is. I think it fits now and has like a lot more synergy with the rest of the dragon fights that we get in the game. I love the Midgard Sormer boss fight. Strongest end of dungeon boss 2.x has. Unfortunately, horrible second boss. I'm sorry, I have never liked the stupid flying fire-dropping plane. It isn't the worst of 2.x, but it still gets a big fat 0 that holds the Keeper of the Lake down this far. I just hate fighting that thing on melee. It's a miserable time. Still, Keeper exists as a promise of the quality that was to come. Even if it's not in my top 5 overall ARR dungeons, when you count both the 2.x and launch combat combined, I could fully understand if somebody said it was their favorite. It is a big thing, and it was a really good promise of what's to come. Flux says, and they nerfed him too, shortened the fire puddles by a lot. They did! He still flies around a lot, and that's the pain in the neck part. I'm not actually a big fan of this one, but I think that's because I always seem to get an adventure roulette. Understandable. Uh, 37. Smileton. Once again, dungeons I wish I could put much higher. One of the game's wildest damn dungeon concepts. An unfinished housing complex beneath the surface of the moon where the robots creating it have gone haywire. It's accompanied by an amazing soundtrack. The Escher-inspired impossible streets of Smileton give way to literally twisting and turning halls, and eventually layers where you literally see the dungeon being 3D printed in front of you. It's insane art design and creativity on display. It has 2 really good bosses, too. Face is dead pretty fast these days, but has fun mechanics and constantly changes up how it works. Similarly, Big Cheese has one core mechanic in the conveyor explosives, and then is spicing it up by mixing it up with different attacks while you fight him. Unfortunately, Smileton does have 2 big blemishes that drag it down. For one, it once again suffers from Endwalker's perpetual issue of having really boring trash. And second, its second boss has one gimmick on repeat that takes forever to execute and does almost nothing. It's honestly a really boring boss fight at this point in the game. And those big blemishes on the scores did drag Smileton all the way down here. I mean, down in this case is still our first dungeon to achieve 21 out of 35, which is to say a 3 out of 5 average. And with a reminder that dungeons can score zeros like this did, that's pretty good. I wouldn't blame anybody for placing it higher just for the sheer creativity that went into its visual design. I would have if I was just doing this off of gut instinct. I love Smileton, but it does have its weak points. Oh, my song. This dungeon destroyed me for so long, and then I abandoned my old computer. That might have been the last dungeon, though, but... it's lower than I'd expect. Yeah, I really wish I could have given this one more. There's a couple dungeons coming up like that. Okay. 36. The Great Gooble Library. Hard mode. The second best hard mode dungeon. Also, again, hasn't had its original appear on this list yet, and the strength of the original is probably a very good part of what carries it here. What's nice about the return trip? For starters, the place is now more lit up, so we're better able to appreciate the fantastic visual design of the giant library. It's a gorgeous place, and we get similarly gorgeous music, which feels way more constructed than the original, which makes sense. We've partially uncursed this place. What also helps the hard mode stand tall is the boss fights. Not the first one, mind you. It turns out when you take the demon out of its tome, it's still not a very interesting fight. But Living Flame's various transformations and mechanics keep the fresh fight and interesting as the light version of a raid boss. Then you have the fun of the bookworm owl at the end, Strix, who has the fun puzzle of setting up various status effects that you'll use in order to combat his own magic, but only when the time is right to do it right. Oh, and him summoning a behemoth is just hilarious to me. It's a really good fight that punishes unobservant players hard. I'm pretty sure you can see a body somewhere in that screenshot. What does limit the library's return visit to me is, as mentioned, its first boss isn't so great, and its trash pulls aren't really that much to write home about either. And I think it does lose a tiny bit of identity compared to the, fully cursed tome library that the original is. This doesn't prevent the library from reaching its status as a really well-scoring dungeon. Not quite enough to escape the middle third, but like, we're really in the I like these dungeons category. I don't have problems with these guys. Not like in a significant I hate them way. Cecil said the great goobly moobly. Yep. I'm a sucker for library dungeons. Me too, especially because Google very specifically is kind of a callback to FF5's ancient library, and I'm an FF5 nerd. 35. Holminster Switch. What a damn kickoff to Shadowbringers this was! Accompanied by an intense track that I will forever insist is constructed like a Toho stage theme, Holminster pits you running towards a village falling to the Sin Eaters, and it is every bit the welcome to the new expansion's performance standard that you'd expect. Hard-hitting mobs remind you what it's like to be in a leveling dungeons, and the bosses have stepped the heck up. I love the way the bosses escalate. First is the giant angel from Shadowbringers opening, who covers the entire arena in AoEs. Then we get Forgiven Emotional Gut Punch, who establishes the stakes of the dungeon by not even being the final boss despite her story weight, though she is admittedly a little bit easy as a fight mechanically. And then comes Philia to finish it off, accompanied by the game's first boss title card, and it leaves an impact with huge attacks and tons of variety and signals that, hey, yeah, wake up. Shadowbringers steps it up for its final boss fights, and is the reason that I have been grading final boss fights so harshly, is because Philia set a new standard when Philia showed up. What does limit Holminster to me is a weakness that also pervades many of the dungeons since trash being interesting started to take a bit of a backseat in favor of focusing on the boss fights. Especially with like the last leg of Holminster forcibly spacing out its pulls like that. And while it's a pretty solid atmospheric dungeon, I don't think anything's too crazy to look at. I don't know. It's the conclusion to Shadowbringers' incredibly memorable opening chapter. It's 35th on this list. It is in some damn stiff competition at this point. Oh, my song said, I love how you fight spoilers so early, which makes you think about what will be worse waiting for you later. Yeah. Yoshi said, welcome to Shadowbringers. Complimentary therapy will be provided at the end of the ride. Fairland Blade said, I love how horrifying this place is. Yeah, I probably could have given it more for the transforming eggs and all. Like, it's something, yeah. 34. The Grand Cosmos. I had some trouble deciding if this or Holminster deserved to be higher. I could go either way on any given day, and I find it funny that both of Lakeland's dungeons are adjacent to each other. The Grand Cosmos even has many of the same strengths and scores as Holminster. Like, both of them have pretty forgettable trash and a pretty weak second boss. This time it's Leanne Seed, whose gimmick just pulls you away from combat. But the dungeons both have an excellent first and third boss. Let's face it, nobody does the Seeker of Solitude's brooms correctly. And catching the furnishings in the manor on fire to extinguish your mortal flames is definitely memorable alongside the other big attacks brought forth by Lugus. Where they differ in scores only mildly is in the presentational aspects. I find the Cosmos' music less memorable, as grandiose as it is, but the environment is to me more cool to check out. The manor is full of all sorts of details and pieces. Like, the Ghost Ballroom doesn't need to be there, but it is. Really though, I think the Cosmos does stand on its own fairly solidly. There's just enough competition in this sort of, like, noble style fantasy space to hold the Cosmos back from ascending higher, and it doesn't really hit any single thing out of the park, but it's still in the upper half of the list and like just whiffing on the top third. Dustin said, Versailles, been there? Yeah, actually that's a good point. The aesthetic of this dungeon is very much just like French palace fantasy, you know? It's a little bit boring, but I think even when you are familiar with it, like, it's still solid enough. My gut would have placed this one a little bit lower, but objectively it scores pretty well. 33. Sorkai. It's one of Heavensward's most gorgeous areas, and I think it's easily the best take on the floating island concept that the expansion frequented. It's a grandiose lair that just grows increasingly more impressive, adding environmental details and color with each leg until it all culminates in the golden skies where you get to prove yourself. It does its best to try to fire on all cylinders. Its trash has a bunch of cute touches, like the haste buff from the fan enemies. The Knight Pegasus, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, is a unique fight taking advantage of the arena's long and thin shape. And, of course, at the end, you get to fight Hraesvelgr, and his fight has been completely overhauled recently. You don't have bouncing platforms anymore, but the old fight, my take on it was that it was always, oh, is it a mechanic? Move platform. That's it. Now it actually has a whole lot more cohesion with the other dragon fights, and even has cohesion with a certain savage fight that came out years later. The weak point for me is Chief Moglin's fight. His gimmick of being protected by the Moogle's Guard just has not survived overgearing. It just hasn't. It's, you beat down some ads, tank and spank, and then it's over. Overall, I could see where people would probably argue for this to be even higher as like a big highlight moment of Heavensward, but we're like in banger tier dungeons here. Like, I don't think dungeons can really afford a big weak point like Chief Moglin, but I think this dungeon is otherwise fantastic. Sage says, I'm going to disagree on this one, but this is it has neat ideas, but it's ultimately boring dungeon. I could kind of see that take. Oh, my song said, music's so good, do just dragons have the amazing themes, really? Yeah, understandable. Like, it's okay, but I'm fine with it being average, definitely not 10 to 20. Yeah. 32. Vanispati. The unfortunately weakest of the Endwalker launch dungeons. And by already, or at least leveling dungeons. And, like, frankly, this shouldn't have been this weak. Vanispati is the one time in the game we really get to live the apocalypse, and it is doing its best to provide. What I will say is that the visuals of this place are incredible. Their fire tech was absolutely landing it in this place, and the world is burning around you. And then you emerge out of it, and you climb up onto, like, the cliffs, and the sky is just filled with monsters, and it is wild. And all the detail work put into the bosses and making them horrific, and watching people transform into monsters in front of your eyes, and just, like, there was so much going on here. All set to an intensely dramatic track carried by soulful vocals once it really gets going. Like, it's so good. So, how does Vanispati end up so low in the face of that? Well, again, Endwalker has some pretty bog-standard trash a lot of the time, and honestly, the first two bosses are not super interesting to me. They're each kind of one gimmick on repeat bosses, which isn't really all that great. I like the final boss. He is intense. He will beat the snot out of players who are not paying attention. He's a great fight. But he's the, like, only good place part of the gameplay to be a Vanispati. The rest of it is this place being carried by you are living the apocalypse. Fire Lamplight said, I think the last leg is the strongest part. Absolutely. Flux said, when you hit the second boss, you realize the true horror that it's actually a backward elephant head. Yep. Yeah, this place is distressing, it's tense. I just... yeah, it's really good. Sage said, this isn't the leveling dungeon I would have praised here, but I respect it at least. Fair enough. 31. as the last dungeon of this leg of the recording. The Stigma Dreamscape. God, I wish I could justify this one being higher and making it into the top third, but here we are. This is the most high-concept, ridiculous dungeon 14 has gotten to date. You are, and stay with me here if you don't know this one, in the digital memories of a race of spacefaring, warmongering robots, rewriting their recollection of conquest to convince them of their vulnerability. And this place goes insane on the sci-fi look and design. Absolutely just off its rocker. Like, the segment that lets us witness the death of the Dragon Star? Just the most memorable identity in Endwalker to me. And that is saying something because it was Endwalker. And that's why I'm so mad this dungeon is held back by lifeless trash, weakened by a third boss that has unfortunately suffered due to overgearing. And while I do like Escape as a track a lot, I do kind of wish it was more than just the live band version of Escape and was more of a rearrangement of Escape that did something more. That isn't to say it's all bad. Like, the first couple bosses are fine on a boss fight front, but just... like, I just feel like I have to be harsh on this one because I really love this, but also there are points that drag it down that... Thus, it's the highest placing of the middle tier dungeons in FF14, even though, like, if you ask me about dungeons I love, this is like SS tier. I love this place. Obear said another one lower than expected. He said just short of the top third. Yep. Oh, my song said I kind of like this one more than most of Endwalker's final story dungeon. Huh. Interesting. Alright, cool. We're done the second leg. I need to, once again, get up, stretch, and down some water and load up the last file, so this part of the video is done. I suggest that you also take 5 during that time. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in part 3.